Hello everyone and welcome to the MS-DOS project. It's been a while since my last video was put out, and since then my life's been pretty wild with getting married, getting back to school, but I finally found a good space of time to put towards at least this video. I finally finished this fun game and I'm excited to share its history, gameplay experience, and how well I think the whole thing still works today. The release of Ultima 6 was a massive turning point for Origin Systems as a company, in more ways than one. It was the first game primarily developed for IBM PC, completely abandoning the Apple II and most other personal computer platforms. As such, the engine itself was a massive technical upgrade, being the first game in the series to use 256 color VGA graphics, as well as support for Sound Blaster and MIDI sound and a much larger and more alive-feeling game world. The engine was not only a massive leap for the Ultima series, it is also far ahead of almost all other RPGs on the market. Richard Garriott had always made it kind of a point to use an almost entirely new engine for every mainline Ultima game, but especially for the massive change and time crunch done for Ultima 6, the amount of money that had gone into developing the engine was much higher than it had ever been before. If you want to learn more about the development behind Ultima 6 and haven't watched my video on it, you can do so here. With this massive investment into new technology and the inevitable long wait before Ultima 7, Origin started to explore the possibility of reusing the engine for other spin-off titles. Probably the biggest proponent of this idea was Jeff Johannigman, a programmer who had been hired over from EA around the time that Ultima 6 was being shipped. Pretty much as soon as he got there, he started tossing around the idea with directors Warren Spector and Dallas Snell about reusing the engine. They said pretty early on that they would leave the straight fantasy RPG setting for Lord British and the main Ultima games, but would love to play with different genres and settings. Of the ideas thrown around, the two biggest ones that came up were a Lost World jungle punk type of setting and a Victorian steampunk adventure. Both would end up getting used and produced, but they went with the Lost World concept first. Unfortunately, at the time that these ideas were really gaining traction, Origin was still experiencing a lot of growing pains. Origin had hired a lot of top talent and had 4 producers available, but Robert Garriott really hadn't sat down and organized who did what and when. That meant that the projects were just assigned to whoever was available at the time, instead of the producer who had skills geared towards that particular project or was passionate about it.
But you can't do this to me. I started this company. You know how much I sacrificed?
As a result of this, even though the Doc Savage jungle adventure game was Warren Spector's idea, it ended up being Johannigman's project because of Warren's involvement in Wing Commander at the time. Luckily for us, he was still a great director, but this lack of proper upper management ended up rearing its head in ugly ways later on for Origin. Because the project was intended as a stopgap game to tide people over and make back some of the massive investment in new tech for Ultima 6, it needed to not only be made quickly, but also be a significantly smaller and less ambitious game than a regular Ultima game. This also had the effect of needing less floppy disks, which would help cut some costs for Origin, who always insisted on going above and beyond in their game boxes and including proper manuals and maps. I'll talk a bit about how this development philosophy shows in final product when I get to the gameplay section of the review. One of the most critical additions to the team was writer Siobhan Beeman, who had gained a lot of writing and programming experience in the engine while working on Ultima 6. Beeman helped institute some of the upgrades to the engine, including those of a more interactable world, as well as having better animated sequences for both the introduction and ending. Beeman also brought aboard former Steven Jackson Games co-worker Aaron Alston to the project, who really helped to write and shape the characters and world. One of the biggest changes during development that immediately became apparent was that the avatar would be a male-only character for the first time. Although the engine certainly would have supported both genders as it had in Ultima 6, there were two main interconnected concerns that prevented this from happening. The first was that the game was to play heavily into the Victorian jungle adventure trope, with the male, quote-unquote, civilized hero having a female tribal love interest. They could try to rewrite characters and dialogue in Lynch Adventure Story to include a potential love interest for a female avatar, but this would have run counter to the whole idea of having less discs for the smaller scale Ultima and increased time and cost of production. The team also floated the idea of having the option of a potential same-gender romantic partners for the avatar, but this was something the team knew they couldn't do. Ultima already had a sort of unearned reputation for being satanic. In releasing a game in 1990 that allowed for gay or lesbian love affairs would have created a media firestorm that the already struggling company just couldn't afford. Even though the creators would have zero problem with it, they couldn't put their livelihoods at stake for it. Thus the decision was finally made to only have the male option for this game. Richard Garriott believed that role-playing games did not necessarily need to be completely free to give you the choice of creating whatever kind of character you want to play, but they could also be used to have you learn to play the role of a pre-existing character. Thus, as the series progressed and the character of the avatar became more cemented, less focus was put on character creation and more on how you should interact with the world as this mythical figure. Of course, you can still choose to be a criminal in a menace to society, but there were always consequences, and learning to be virtuous in difficult situations became a core component of the series going forward. Besides the initial world and plot design, development seems to have gone fairly smoothly, as most of the kinks of the actual engine were worked out while developing Ultima 6. Worlds of Ultima: The Savage Empire was released worldwide for MS-DOS computers at the very end of 1990, only about 7 months after Ultima 6 had hit store shelves earlier that year. Despite being very well critically received, the game struggled to sell, selling at only about 40,000 copies, compared to the over 100,000 sold by Ultima 6 in 1990 alone. Luckily, Origin still viewed it as enough of a success to go ahead with the sequel spin-off, which I will talk about in a future video. Although this was a more budget-focused release for Origin, they still had tons of goodies in the box. First, you have the box with stellar cover art as always, and a backside which gives you a pretty good idea of how the game is similar to previous Ultima games but also differs drastically from it. Of course, you had the game on several discs, either 5¼ inch or 3½ inch, some various installation documentation, etc., and a map that, while not cloth this time, is a high-quality paper map and is very useful to help you navigate the world and find the different tribes. And of course there's a manual, this time in the style of a magazine. And I think we're seeing a theme of scantily clad women here already. They really did lean into that trope, didn't they? It is, however, a great manual and definitely a must-read, as it essentially provides a much more detailed prologue to the story than is what's actually given or told in the game. It also gives us a quick survey of the tribes, as well as the various flora and fauna of the world we will be exploring. There's also some fun ads for mostly fake products. And yes, this t-shirt was real, but it was a pre-order exclusive for a pretty poorly selling game, so my hopes of finding it eventually are not very high. The installation is very straightforward, simply asking for a location of installation, a few video options, and a few sound options, choosing between Sound Blaster, AdLib, and Roll and MP32. After just a few minutes and a disk swap, the game is ready to boot up. Upon boot up, there are a few intro cards, and then you see this awesome title screen with the dinosaurs and the jungle. And then it starts to pan with some developer credits and shots of the jungle and temples. I talked previously about how Origin was patterning their teams and design philosophy off of the film industry, but with this game they really started to lean into that motif, including a very tongue-in-cheek article in the Ultimate Adventures manual about how the Savage Empire was supposedly filmed and produced by Richard Garriott and the Origin crew. And look, even Mark Romero is in this picture. Kind of awesome to me, the nexus of brilliant game developers who met at Origin in the early 90s, and then went on to make even more groundbreaking projects afterwards. After these brief title cards, we are brought to the title menu. There are only 4 options here, which makes it easy to understand what everything does. First is the story so far, which shows us a mini introduction. I'll come back to this in a minute. The next option is of course character creation. It's essentially a very pared down version of the character creation of Ultimas 4 through 6. Instead, with appropriately a tribal shaman asking your name and a few virtue questions that inevitably affect your stats. This game isn't too terribly difficult, however, so I wouldn't stress your stats too much. After finishing this quick process, you're kicked back to the main menu where you see the 2 final menu options. About the Savage Empire gives a very brief developer credits and even asks why you're still watching them once the names finish rolling past. And of course, Journey Onwards drops you into your new game or current save file. Getting back to the story so far, the premise is fairly simple. You start off having a bad dream of a faraway land, monsters, and a princess in distress. Lord British visits you in the same dream and tells you to find out all you can about the moonstone you received in Ultima 6. So you visit your friend Dr. Rafkin at a museum to see if he could help you divine its properties. While there, you meet the in-game author of the Ultimate Adventures manual, Jimmy, who seems to be overly suspicious. But when Rafkin's experiment on the moonstone goes wrong, all 3 of you in the professor's lab are sucked into a black moon gate, ripping it into a faraway jungle land. You soon meet the woman you dreamed about, and she seems quite taken with you as you have a few adventures. However, her suitor is not happy about the situation, and he arrives to take her away, severely injuring you and scattering your friends in the process. And this is where the game starts. Obviously this intro is a pretty big downgrade from Ultima 6, technically, but knowing the scope, budget, and time constraints of this project, I can understand that, and it's actually quite effective and good looking for what it is. You get a basic understanding of the plot that's enhanced by the manual if you desire, and going back and watching it for this review actually helped me resolve a few lingering questions and gripes I had with the way the story is presented in the game. Upon starting the game, you are greeted by the chief of the Korok tribe, who is the father of the woman you met earlier, Ayala. And of course, being the first conversation you have in the game, he provides the obligatory early 90s copy protection. He asks you a question about some piece of information in the manual, and helpfully gives you a page number of where to find it. If you answer incorrectly, he says something about how your memory's still not right and you need to rest, unceremoniously kicking you back to the DOS prompt. When you do answer correctly, he will give you information on where to find Jimmy and Rafkin, and asks you to rescue Ayala. He also provides you with your first companion, a shaman in training, Triolo. And yes, he is basically this game's self-aware version of YOLO. In fact, there are inserts of Shamano and Dupre as well, who you can also have join your party later on. Triolo was incredibly important, however, because as far as I'm aware, he's the only character you can recruit that has the ability to cast any sort of magic. Before we get to any of this game's unique systems, I think it would be appropriate to highlight some of the immediate visual improvements. Probably the most obvious is the new dialogue system. In Ultima 6, whenever you talk to someone, it would take their small, and probably quite ugly, portrait into the top corner, and then their dialogue into the scroll in the bottom right. Here they've made everything much more visible, by blowing up the portrait to fill more of the corner of the screen, and hiding the world view to show dialogue, which also makes it easier to read. Everything else is basically the same with highlighted keywords and such, but this is just such a huge improvement that I only noticed in retrospect, but made the experience of talking to NPCs much better. The visual presentation overall, too, seems to have been stepped up a bit. Although the beginning and ending cutscenes are relatively more simplistic than what we had in Ultima 6, there are several scripted sequences where the worldview is hidden away and there are sort of mini cutscenes with very well drawn pixel art giving a good representation of events. Other than the cutscenes, the world of Aedan, where the Savage Empire takes place, is very visually distinct from Britannia of Ultima 6. Somehow almost all the areas in that game looked pretty red or dark green, including the caves. Here the overall is more of a bright green and brown, with the caves being grey, and several areas that are very visually distinct. I think it does have more variety than Ultima 6 did, despite being in a jungle. However, on the opposite end of this, the graphics seem to be even more muddy than they were in Ultima 6. The new enemies such as dinosaurs and other creatures look great, but oftentimes the NPCs can just blend into the environment, and many times they look so visually indistinct that you have to talk to the entire village to find one or two important people. And here is probably one of my biggest gripes with the game. In Ultima 6, it seemed that every NPC had a distinct face, personality, and things to say, as well as a personal schedule of things they did and places they went. Here, I don't think most of the NPCs really have schedules at all, and outside of the chief and shaman of every tribe and the occasional vendor or other character, all the tribals of the same tribe, male or female, share the exact same dialogue tree that doesn't tell you very much, and all male and all female NPCs share the same portrait, so one for males and one for females. I can understand why this is the way it is, as the game was made on a very small budget in a very short time frame, but it's something that disappointed me while exploring the world. The interface also gets a visual facelift here, as it looks as if it's been carved out of stone like some Mayan or Aztec temple, and the icons have been appropriately adapted to this theme. There isn't much changed here, as the commands are all basically the same as before. I do wish the game would have tried to more fully commit to visual icons available for every command, because actions like saving and quitting are still exclusively found on the keyboard and not on screen. It still works though, if a bit obtuse at times. Of course the presentation wouldn't be complete without music to listen to. Here's a small sample of the MT32 version that I listened to while playing the game. I have mixed thoughts on the soundtrack. It does sound very nice, with the few tracks setting a good atmosphere and fitting in very nicely with the setting. However, there are very few tracks, and they are all kind of so minimalist that not a single tune really seems to stand out to me, and I can hardly even remember them without listening to them again. Now, I can be down for minimalist soundtracks. I controversially really love Breath of the Wild's original soundtrack even on its own, but almost all of the environmental music in this game just seems very forgettable. The tracks you tend to hear in towns are more friendly and enjoyable, however, so it isn't all bad. Just not the usual awesomeness you get from most Ultima games. Enough of the negatives for now. Getting out into the world shows you that you have a lot of tools to use to interact with the world this go-round. When you meet up with Rafkin again, he can instruct you on how to make rudimentary guns and grenades, and he even has some snarky little comments about teaching you how to do this. Now, since Rafkin's lab was transported to Aeon wholesale, a lot of the necessary ingredients can be found there, but those are of limited quantity. Luckily, he also has the tools that can help you to build whatever you may need. That includes collecting tar from pits to help build grenades, finding the components of gunpowder, and even using a fire extinguisher to cool and cross lava pits. These are not only optional features, but at many points necessary to progress or to get to certain areas, so you will want to take note of all the different things you get and how you can use them to give you an advantage. With all these tools at your disposal, you are ready to tackle your first quest, to rescue the Princess Ayala. You will of course want to collect the people who came from Earth with you. Rafkin is useful for the aforementioned scientific knowledge, and Jimmy has probably one of my favorite clever uses of a character in the game. Since he's a reporter, he keeps studious notes on things you need to do and what you have been told, essentially giving you a sort of progress log you can check. If you ever step away from the game for a few days or weeks and come back, you can ask Jimmy to tell you what is going on, and he will help remind you of where you're at and the tasks you need to complete. Honestly, I wish more games would take this approach, as it can be very hard to remember what the heck you are doing when you leave a game for a long period of time, but I also think it's much more immersive to have it be a sort of journal instead of a map with markers all over it that you just have to run to. Anyways, you will soon be wanting to accomplish your first task of rescuing the princess. The problem, however, is that the tribal that captured her, Darden, is chief of a tribe that no one seems to know where to find. It certainly isn't indicated on your map. So you have to start asking around to see if anyone knows something that could lead you to them. It definitely starts to feel like a classic Ultima here. Eventually someone tells you that a former shaman of the Urali tribe, the tribe that Darden is chief of, is on an island up north. When you do find him, however, he is a bit mad, saying that a rival shaman stole his brains and put them in a rock. I mean, I've heard of rocks for brains, but not like this. Upon finding the shaman, he said it was a trick he played on him to get him to go away and not harm them. Just bringing him any old blue rock would suffice. After doing so, he tells you where the Urali tribe is and gives you some turtle bait? I mean, that may be useful later, I hope so. Anyways, at this point, you've probably engaged in combat against dinosaurs or some other large creature. The combat is basically the same here as it was in Ultima 6. Turn-based combat where you can control all of your party, some of it, or just yourself, and have everyone else be automated. There are a few wrinkles though, including firearms and a radically different magic system. Firearms are fairly straightforward. There's the modern rifle that works just like a bow or other projectile weapon, but much more powerful, being able to down most things in a shot or two. The caveat, of course, is that the ammo supply is extremely limited, and there's no way to create more. Thus, this often becomes an emergency weapon more than anything. On the other hand, you can craft bamboo flintlocks for the party under Rafkin's instruction, which will need to be manually reloaded with gunpowder after each shot. Although not as effective or powerful as the modern rifle, it's still incredibly effective and capable of dealing tons of damage. You can also make grenades based on Rafkin's instruction, which, while useful in combat, are almost equally or more useful in puzzles and problem solving throughout the game. About the magic system, it's the real reason you keep Triolo around the whole time. Magic is accessed through 3 totems representing the spirits of Aphaz, Motaz, and Helos. When one of the 3 ingredients is used on the totems, it will result in an incantation. This results in only 9 in total, and because of that the combat usefulness of shamanism is basically nil. However, it is still very important to be able to heal your party, and that's really the only spell I found myself using throughout. Of course, since we don't have the Shrines of Virtue to worship at and creates our stats this time, the level up system you'll eventually run into after enough combat is very different, but also much more convenient. As before, you can level up when accruing the appropriate number of experience points, hitting 100 for level 1 and doubling from there. But this time it's accessed through resting your party. Upon sleeping, you'll get a little dialogue popping up describing a dream where the character chases 3 animals through a forest. You have to decide which one to follow, and that means the stat increase in one area. The bear is strength, the jaguar is dexterity, and the monkey is intelligence. Intelligence is really not worth leveling for anyone except Triolo, as it really just governs magic. Dexterity is an easy recommendation for combat effectiveness, as it's on the ultimate 6-inch and misses are very common, and when you're using up precious bullets or arrows, keeping those to a minimum will definitely increase your enjoyment. And of course, strength is always an easy recommendation, as it dictates how hard you hit and how much members of your party can carry you. Getting back to the main quest, you will want to head over to the Urali tribe in order to open the plot up. Having found the cave the former shaman told you about and traveling through it, you now have a new obstacle. A T-Rex! It wouldn't be a good game with dinosaurs without one. And although you may be sorely tempted to try to get that Tyrannosaurus trophy, like in Jurassic Park, nothing you do will be able to kill it. You could try to run past, but in all likelihood you and most of your party will get killed off by it. And death is much harder to come back from here than in mainline Ultima games, as there isn't really any resurrect spell or anything like that I'm aware of. So you basically have to die to get resurrected by a shaman. So to avoid becoming Dino Dinner, you will have to find a way around. Luckily, the shaman gave you access to an unlikely mode of transportation. Turtles! Using the turtle bait will allow you to summon turtles to help your party travel upriver and around the dino, reaching the Urali tribal lands in relative peace. Even though it's a small and maybe a bit contrived part of the quest, I thought it was kind of a fun idea to use turtles to get around the map a bit, and funnily enough, it's something that'll come back later in a future Warren Spector produced game. When you finally make your way into the Urali village, you will soon see that although they are fairly secretive, they aren't really a warlike and aggressive tribe, just that their usurper chief Darden has led them that way. Luckily, someone has a simple enough plan to depose them. The tribal shaman Womop figures you can get the people to move on from him if you can just liberate the tribal totem Fabaz that Darden has hidden away. This involves going into another cave. Luckily, all it takes to free the spirit totem is to flash a light at it, and if the game's given you any hints on how to generate light, i.e. through Jimmy's camera, it will probably work. That's one thing I love about Ultima, that this game continued really well, that if you try something it'll probably work even if that wasn't necessarily the developer's intent. Breath of the Wild definitely popularized this style of gameplay in recent years, but I think Origin and then Looking Glass really pioneered the immersive nature of gaming. After having awakened Fabaz, it declares that Darden is now an outcast, that Womop is the new chief, the T-Rex will no longer attack you and your party, and gives you the location where Yella is imprisoned. And it's another cave. It does seem like this game loves checking you in caves, as that is the default interior environment, but it isn't too bad as they are mostly easy to navigate until towards the end of the game. Breaking into this cave, you get a short cutscene where you break Aelia out of her imprisonment and embrace, but it isn't long before Darden barges in and you have to face him in modern combat. And he's kind of a pushover, especially if you just shoot him with the modern rifle. Most of the combat in this game is trivial, it seems, once you get the right weaponry and equipment, which is okay because the Savage Empire's real strength is the puzzle solving and crafting, and not so much fighting. After rescuing Ayala, you can talk to her. She does mostly just talk about how much she loves you and such, but if you ask her about materials, she can usually tell you where to find it and how to get it. And now that she's a companion, that's about the end of that storyline. The rest of the game kind of just pivots away from it, and your companions don't usually get any new dialogue as the game progresses. So the love story between Avatar and Ayala just gets shelved from here on out. Now I subscribe to the theory that Ultima games, and really a lot of games, have three distinct story parts, or acts, kind of like a play. While the Ayala story is a decent first act, the second act is where I got more invested. Talking to Ayala will have revealed the threat that a species of ant lake monsters called the Myrmidex poses to all the tribes in Aedan. She proposes uniting the tribes to face the common threat, and doing so is what comprises the majority of the rest of the game. The first few are easy, as Womop agrees on principle that you just set him up as the new chief, and the Kuroks agree because you freed Ayala. One tribe even agrees to it just based on the fact that it's a good idea, but everyone else will need a bit more convincing, as these tribes have kind of been opposed to each other for hundreds of years. The tasks range from simple collection of weapons or artifacts for tribes to monumental tasks like killing T-Rexes and giant apes that are threatening villages. While the majority of these are pretty straightforward and self-explanatory, they are still engaging enough to not lose interest. Plus, with Jimmy taking notes of what people want, it makes it easier than ever to keep track of all the errands you need to run. There are two tasks I want to highlight as particular standouts, however. The first of these is hilarious for the sheer incompetence and boneheadedness of the tribe that necessitates it. The Disqueaky are far from bright, with really only one member remaining that seems to have a head on their shoulders. The chief of the tribe requires you to pass two tests in order to get them to join up, one of bravery and one of skill. Funnily enough, he quips that you could never pass the test of virtue, despite the fact that you've basically spent the last 3 games becoming the living embodiment of virtue. The test of bravery is to simply down a jug of their favorite beverage, Plochta. Apparently this drink is utterly revolting and makes you feel pretty sick for a short time, but at least the effect is very short-lived and it doesn't make you as incompetent as the Disqueaky. The test of skill is simple and dumb at the same time. Disqueaky warriors are being eaten by a T-Rex, which then staggers off to sleep off of the massive amount of Plochta it just ingested and returns for more later. Instead of asking you to kill it like a reasonable tribe does, they want you to somehow attach a bell around its neck so they can hear it coming in their drunken stupor and flee. This may seem suicidal, but luckily the jailer Larray has some smarts and suggests constructing a spear with an attached jug of plachta, then hurling that at the dino to knock it out temporarily. Somehow this works, and the Disqueequee live to drunkenly stumble along another day. The other tribe is notable for the seeming impossibility of even getting them to talk to you. Although they appear the most advanced in their finite city, the Nahuatl are ruled by an invulnerable power-mad dictator and his shaman who has also lost his mind. Even attempting to converse with the cheap Huitzilopochtli will end in combat, essentially meaning death, as he somehow has a field around him at all times that absorbs all damage. Their exiled ruler was staying with the Disqueequee tribe and tells you he would gladly join you and the other tribes if you can figure out how to dethrone Huitzilopochtli. The jailed former shaman tells you the same, and that the power seems to be connected to the new shaman. You're able to find out that the shaman has a former assistant Fritz, and with enough asking around to all the tribes, you will find him hiding out. It's even possible you investigated this early on, as some people will mention Fritz to you offhandedly. He tells you about how he and his former friend, Dr. Spectre, came to Aeon from Earth in a very similar manner to what happened to you at the beginning of the game. And yes, it is that Warren Spectre. Even Richard Garriott wasn't this shameless in his self-inserts. Fritz also gives you the lowdown on how he became corrupted and power mad. Apparently, Dr. Spectre disappeared for weeks one time and came back with a strange glow, rambling about incredible powers he discovered, even bringing a crystal brain to demonstrate them, proclaiming he would use them to conquer Earth. Fritz stole the brain and hid away, while Dr. Spectre, now known as Actraiser, helped usurp power in the most advanced tribe in Aeon. Fritz is more than willing to give you the brain, and it is on you to figure out what exactly Spectre found and how to take away his powers and restore his mind. Eventually, you're able to discover the entrance to an ancient underground city. The crystal brain can be used to repair a robot of some kind named Untitled, who can give you some lore behind the people there who used to inhabit the city, the coddle, and guide you on where to go. You'll run into Dr. Spectre here, who is surprised that you found it. He does try to block your way and taunt you, but he's pretty harmless besides that. Luckily, this city and its guardians provide a lot of cool lore, and you better not skip past it, because this stuff is awesome.
Is no one interested in history?
It turns out that the Codal created the Myrmidex as simple work slaves, but eventually they turned on them and completely destroyed the Codal, which adds kind of another neat wrinkle to this. And I'm convinced that Warren Spectre really loves the ancient destroyed people plotline, as it is even more central to the plot in his two main Ultima projects of Martian Dreams and Serpent Isle. You can also pick up some good gear that will make the endgame easier, so make sure to scour around for anything that seems useful. Eventually, after fighting off robo-dinosaurs and exploring the city, you're able to get over to the generators that are powering the whole thing. Smashing the controls will power these generators down. Unfortunately, this means your temporary robo-buddy and companion, Untitled, is powering down, but also that Dr. Spectre has returned to normal and receives his sanity back. Now you have to escape a quickly collapsing city, and upon doing so the entrance seals itself off, destroying any evidence of the ancient coastal civilization beneath. Now that you've agreed to get all the tribes to unite, there is but one thing to do. Build a giant drum, apparently? I guess no one will know to just meet up without it or something, so you have to hunt a saber-toothed tiger for its skin to repair the thing. Luckily, this is pretty trivial, and building and using it will send us directly to the very, very short final act of the game. This all takes place in the Myrmidex caves, and essentially just has you wander and fight any Myrmidex you find, while looking for the moonstones that started this whole thing. Luckily, if you find the locator in the Coddle City, this becomes much easier. After a pretty anticlimactic battle with the Myrmidex Queen and destruction of the corrupted moonstone, it's over. Honestly, this end sequence is kind of a letdown, as I didn't feel like there was really that much payoff for building up the huge threat of the Myrmidex the whole game, and for building up your whole army of tribes that are united together. Sure, they can poison you, but at this point you should have enough reagents to heal up your party whenever that happens. So, killing the Queen and the Moonstone drives the Myrmidex mad, causing them to destroy themselves as you escape. The tribes hold a great feast and festival to celebrate. However, soon the shade of Lord British appears to you and tells you it's time to leave, summoning a moon gate that carries you, Jimmy, Spectre, and Fritz home to Earth while Rafkin stays behind to help out the tribes. And there isn't even really a sad goodbye to Yella, who is supposedly your lover. Just move on and head back to Earth. And that's Savage Empire. I thought it was a pretty good game for a first attempt at an Ultima spin-off, and while it seems to be lacking in several key areas, it more than made up for it in charm, atmosphere, and interactivity. Overall, if you enjoy any of the Ultima games, or are a fan of the jungle punk type adventure genre, this is a game I would definitely recommend to you. And it's available completely for free on GOG.com, so go ahead and try it. Thanks so much to everyone that waited for this review, and those who are watching now that didn't wait as long. It's taken me way too long to write this review since finishing the game a few months ago, because navigating school and life have been tough, but here it is at last. Hopefully, I'll finally be able to get in more of a groove and release some videos of other games I've had on the back burner for a while. Next Ultima video will be Ultima Underworld before I do the second World of Ultima game, Martian Dreams, but expect a few other smaller projects between now and then. Thanks so much for watching, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.